jungle had grown quiet again. Smoke no longer choked the air, and the sugar plant that had been the battlefield of betrayal lay in smoldering ruins. Alejandro El Fuego Morales was gone, or so everyone thought. His sister, Lucia, had been rescued, now living under a new identity in Spain, and Captain Sofia Reyes had been reinstated, celebrated as a national hero. Yet, peace in Colombia was always fleeting. High in the mountains where Alejandro had disappeared, rumors whispered through the villages. A shadow moving among the ruins, a figure with eyes that glowed like embers, whose presence turned night into firelight. El Hombre de Ceniza, the man of ash, had survived. Alejandro crouched in the remnants of an abandoned estate, hidden beneath the jungle canopy. His face was lined with soot, scars fresh and old, eyes cold as steel. The world had burned around him, but he had learned in fire. Survival wasn't enough. Revenge had taught him restraint, strategy, patience. He had been betrayed once, but he would not be caught unprepared again. Months passed, and Alejandro worked quietly, rebuilding networks from the shadows. Former Morales loyalists, scattered and broken, found him. They swore loyalty to the king who had risen from nothing and survived the impossible. Information flowed through them. Vega's remaining men, politicians who had quietly taken Vega's bribes, and new criminal factions hungry for power. The cocaine routes were fragmented, and a vacuum of violence and opportunity had emerged. Meanwhile, in Medellín, chaos began to stir. Small cartels, emboldened by Vega's fall, started claiming territories, each vying for dominance. Murders rose, traffickers disappeared, and police corruption, though exposed, still allowed the shadows to creep back into the city. Sofia Reyes, vigilant and sharp, noticed the subtle signs. The patterns didn't make sense at first, until she saw the unmistakable mark of Alejandro's return. Precision, strategy, and a single message left for his enemies at every crime scene. Ashes burned into letters. The fire never dies. Alejandro's first target was the remnants of Vega's network, the men who had stolen from him, the traitors who had joined the wolf. One by one, they fell, each demise leaving a signature so precise that nobody could mistake the origin. He moved like a ghost, a phantom force of retribution, leaving chaos in his wake without ever appearing openly. But the king had not returned merely for revenge. He needed to rebuild his empire, different this time. He would not rely solely on fear. He understood loyalty, networks, and leverage in ways that Vega never had. Alejandro reached out to former allies, local informants, and even corrupt officials who had once served Vega, bringing them together under a single, invisible banner. In Madrid, Lucia read the news reports about Alejandro's quiet war from afar. She sat in a small apartment, her heart racing, torn between relief and fear. Her brother was alive, but this path could destroy him or anyone caught in his orbit. She wrote a letter to Sofia, warning her of Alejandro's movements, but a small, trembling part of her admired him. The fire in him was eternal, and she knew it would never be quenched. Back in Colombia, Alejandro made his way to a high-rise overlooking the port of Cartagena. From this vantage point, he could see the ships docked, the trucks moving through the streets, and the shadowy figures who controlled commerce in the city. He had come full circle. From street kid to king, betrayed, burned, and reborn. Every glance reminded him of what was lost. Vega, the soldiers, the men who died believing in a king, but also of what could still be won. That night, Alejandro called a meeting with his closest confidants, men and women who had survived Vega's purge. He spoke not of blood, not of vengeance, but of strategy. Smuggling routes to reclaim, territories to influence, and alliances to forge with those who feared the chaos that had fallen before. They listened, eyes wide, hearts tethered to the same fire that had forged their leader. Yet Alejandro knew the danger was never gone. Sofia Reyes was still out there, and though she had once allied with him to destroy Vega, she was law and he was legend. Eventually, their paths would cross again. Perhaps as enemies, perhaps as reluctant allies. As the moon rose over the Caribbean waters, Alejandro stepped onto the balcony of the high-rise. watching the city he had built from fire and ash. In the distance, a convoy moved under cover of night. An unfamiliar faction, a new threat. He smiled, a slow, dangerous curl of the lips. The fire was not finished. It never would be. In the jungle, a single owl screeched, and Alejandro melted into the shadows, ready to strike again. El Hombre de Ceniza was back, not as a king seeking vengeance, but as a legend reshaping his empire. And somewhere in Medellín, whispers began anew. The fire is coming. El Fuego is alive. The war had ended, but the empire had only just begun. The city of Medellín had learned to breathe again, but the air was thick with the scent of fear. Alejandro El Fuego Morales had returned from the shadows, building a new empire in secrecy. His enemies whispered that he had become more than a man. He was a myth, a force of nature who struck without warning and vanished without a trace. El Hombre de Ceniza, the man of ash, was everywhere and nowhere. But legends are never untouchable. From a high-rise office overlooking the port, Alejandro surveyed his network, aware that his empire could crumble just as quickly as it had been built. Rumors of new international players, mercenaries, and ambitious cartels reached his ears. For the first time, he felt the weight of vigilance pressing against him. Captain Sofia Reyes had been monitoring his movements. Though she had once allied with him to destroy Vega, she knew Alejandro's rise could destabilize Colombia. She couldn't arrest a myth, but she could prepare. Sofia's intelligence team tracked shipments, decrypted communications, and watched shadows move where no law could reach. She respected Alejandro, but respect was not trust. Meanwhile, Alejandro convened his inner circle. These were survivors, loyalists who had walked through fire with him and emerged unbroken. Plans were drawn, routes secured, rivals neutralized, and contingencies prepared. Alejandro's philosophy had changed. Brutality was still a tool, but calculation was now the weapon of kings. Then came the warning. A rival cartel, led by a man known only as El Tiburon, struck a warehouse in Cali, killing dozens of Alejandro's men and sending a message. The king would have challengers, and his empire would not remain untested. Alejandro's response was swift. He moved silently, striking at El Tiburon's operations with precision, burning convoys, intercepting shipments, and leaving symbols of ash etched into the walls of every stronghold. The fire never dies. Each strike was surgical, designed to dismantle without unnecessary bloodshed, a testament to the lessons learned from Vega's betrayal. But Alejandro knew this was a war that could not be fought alone. He reached out to Lucia Morales. Now in Spain, her intelligence and connections invaluable. She had grown strong in exile, navigating her own webs of secrecy and influence. With her help, Alejandro intercepted international shipments, exposed corrupt officials, and tightened his grip on the empire. The final confrontation came on the outskirts of Medellín. El Tiburon had gathered his mercenaries, confident that Alejandro would not challenge him directly. Alejandro, however, was never direct. He orchestrated an ambush, using the terrain, the shadows, and misdirection to his advantage. Helicopters cut through the night sky, but they were Alejandro's. The rival cartel was ensnared in a labyrinth of fire, smoke, and precise gunfire. Amid the chaos, Alejandro faced El Tiburon in the main warehouse. The man was brutal, confident, but untested against a king who had survived death itself. Their fight was violent and primal. Fists, knives, and gunfire intertwining in a storm of survival. Alejandro's experience and rage carried him, and with one final, decisive move, he ended El Tiburon's reign. The rival cartel crumbled, their leaders either dead or fleeing into the night. As the dust settled, Alejandro stood among the ruins of his enemy's empire. He did not celebrate. He did not smile. The fire of ambition, vengeance, and survival burned quietly within him. The jungle whispered around him, carrying echoes of the past. Vega's betrayal, the sugar plant, the flames that had defined his life. Sofia Reyes arrived shortly after, her team at the perimeter. She saw Alejandro standing alone, victorious but haunted. For a moment, They simply looked at each other. Law and legend, morality and myth, balancing on a knife's edge. "You've won," Sofia said quietly. Alejandro's eyes were steady, unreadable. "For now," he replied. Lucia arrived later, silently observing her brother. She knew the fire that consumed Alejandro could never be extinguished. It had shaped him, defined him, and would continue to dictate his path. The final scene stretched into silence. Alejandro walked toward the mountains, disappearing into the mist, leaving the city in uneasy peace. Medellín had a king again, but this king was a shadow, a myth, a force of fire that could not be controlled. The world had witnessed the rise, the betrayal, the fall of Vega, and the resurgence of El Fuego. Yet even as empires burned and ashes settled, one truth remained: the fire never dies. Somewhere deep in the jungle, Alejandro paused, looking back at the city that had molded him. He whispered to the wind, "This is only the beginning," and the flames flickered in reply, dancing across the horizon, eternal.